Gavin Zeitz, and I'm a landscape architect from the United States. Originally, I grew up in Maine, so it's kind of the northeasternmost state, and it's quite chilly there. And so I've always kind of been fascinated with these northern geographies. And so for the past couple of years, I've been really researching the Arctic and kind of what's happening there, and looking kind of holistically at what we can start to address in terms of issues there. And so I kind of want to start in reverse with a video I took this summer while doing some research in Greenland. And this kind of gives you a glimpse into some of the Inuit traditions that are occurring there. And so this is my friend Anna. She's from the northeast of Greenland, and what she's got here is a small seabird called the little auk. And this is a dish called kiviak. And so this is basically hundreds of these birds stuffed into a seal bladder and then sewn up and stuffed underground for about 3 months, and they harvest it in the middle of winter for celebrations like birthdays and weddings. And it's quite an important part of their culture because it replaces kind of a diet exclusively of fish and whale with this seabird. So it's quite a strange way to start a presentation, so you might be wondering what I'm doing kind of here in Greenland. And so I think it kind of started for me a couple of years ago when I read this quite apocalyptic article looking at the Arctic's seed bank. So this is basically a storage place for kind of the global crops, and kind of in case of an emergency or national or international disaster, we would kind of have this backup of our civilization seeds. And so, yeah, for me, this is quite interesting, and I think a lot of us are probably quite familiar with the Arctic kind of being the ground zero of climate change. And we're kind of often berated by large amounts of new reports and scientific findings in the Arctic that are often pretty depressing and kind of hopeless in some way. And for me, I wasn't really seeing these articles address any kind of solutions, and it was kind of quite an interesting opportunity for me as a landscape architect to think about this area and what I could start to engage in terms of landscape architecture's practices. So unfortunately, it's quite difficult to get to the Arctic, and it's very expensive. So I turned to my good friend, Google Earth, and so this was able to allow me to kind of explore far northern oil extraction regions, mines, and kind of remote ports. And so it was a way to kind of start to familiarize myself with this region and kind of the scale and the massive kind of diversity of landscape there. But I kind of wanted to get a bit closer and a bit more personal, so I planned a trip. And so last winter, I went to Alaska. So here you can start to see that I'm able to kind of experience these aerial landscapes and kind of the phenomena and the built conditions. And so for about a week, I kind of traveled around, interviewed people, and kind of started to learn more about the culture there. And what really was kind of amazing to me was that born out of this kind of geographic remoteness, there was kind of this sense of community and a real sort of kinship in the region. And so stepping back, I was quite fascinated with both these ends of spectrums of the scale, from the global kind of planning and political scale all the way down to the local. And so for me, it was kind of a question about the discipline of landscape architecture, and can we really start to kind of look at these very massive issues and complicated subjects and start to design interventions around those, all the way through the regional and network scale to the local, material, and human scale. But as my project started to develop, you can see that it was quite difficult to kind of have these conversations with a lot of professors who might not have kind of a background of the anthropological history of the area. So I was needing a tool that kind of started to explain this. And so this timeline, this visual timeline, started to be able to illustrate kind of the anthropologic history that we've kind of engaged in the Arctic, and kind of how humans have related to the landscape there. So it starts kind of with this first time period about 16,000 years ago, so 4,000 years before agriculture, actually. And so this was kind of the time period where you had a large group kind of coming across the land bridge and starting to settle along Alaska and northern Canada and Greenland. And they had quite a harmonious relationship with the landscape. They're kind of able to live with the environment and able to kind of subsist off the different animals and plants there. It didn't have a huge impact on the landscape. The next kind of phase was kind of the middle of the 1900s, and this was kind of this military type of colonialism where during the World War you started to see US, Russia, and Canada start to build up kind of defense borders along the kind of rim of the Arctic Ocean. And this had quite irreversible effects for the indigenous populations living there. And so lastly, this brings us to kind of phase 3, or like kind of the brink of collapse, which I'd like to call it. And this phase is really kind of defined by a variety of ecological and environmental challenges, kind of ranging from methane release in permafrost all the way to kind of coastal erosion, and then of course sea ice melting. And so I kind of just want to walk through kind of 5 categories. And so first, this is kind of the issue of territory. And as kind of this area becomes quite a contentious geopolitical region, we're seeing that a lot of countries are kind of looking to capitalize and kind of stake their claim in the Arctic, which is kind of increasing the geopolitical contention of the area. Shipping. So as the sea ice starts to melt in the area, we're seeing new opportunities for shipping companies to kind of really decrease costs and the use of fuel by traveling through the Arctic Ocean, which can, in some cases, reduce the amount of traveling time to like about 30 days in some cases. But then this also has massive consequences in terms of tourism and the effect on the cultures there. Industry. So as some of these areas become more and more accessible, we're starting to see kind of prospecting for heavy earth minerals, oil, natural gas. And so these are kind of very difficult questions of how do we balance industry with kind of smart development in the area. And then science. So to understand kind of climate change at a global spectrum, we really need to be traveling throughout the Arctic to gather data and analyze kind of these trends in the Arctic. But right now it's very expensive. There's not very much infrastructure to kind of provide access for these scientists. And then lastly, what I would probably say is that maybe the most urgent issue is kind of the cultural changes that are occurring here. So right up here, you're kind of seeing the permafrost edge of the coastal community, Shishmaref in Alaska, starting to kind of degrade and slowly kind of crumble into the ocean. And so to kind of understand the complexity of this issue, I started to kind of diagram the politics and the cultural and the scientific kind of issues that we were faced with, and looking at how it would start to kind of how it starts to merge with design and where the opportunities are for design, and not just for me, but also kind of how other designers might be able to use this diagram, or how community members might be able to use this diagram to find out and prioritize which issues are most important to them. And so you can imagine within all these categories, there's a whole slew of kind of different agencies who all have different languages of talking about the Arctic, but then also have kind of their own self-interests. And so you have really large oil companies, but then you also have art and culture kind of advocacy groups, and you have scientific organizations. And each of them, with their self-interests, kind of start to define the Arctic in different ways. And so you see kind of a variety and an ambiguity in the kind of boundaries that we create in the Arctic. And then once you start to compose this and overlay it, you can see that it's quite a mess. But underneath this mess, you can kind of see that there really is this one universal Arctic. And so for me, that was really fascinating. I was kind of inspired by this idea of kind of a holistic or kind of universal type of Arctic. And so I started to kind of draft this kind of declaration of the commons, and thinking about the Arctic in terms of kind of 4 priorities that we really need to address. Kind of one being a priority of the indigenous populations there and what's best for them. And second, kind of the concept of demilitarization in the area. And then third, really looking at like transnational political collaboration, how these different kind of territories who all have their own respective boundaries, how they start to collaborate in this area. And then lastly, protecting kind of these very fragile and unique ecosystems. And so when you start to see this come together, it's kind of a network, a map that shows you networks and different transportation zones and nodes of different communities and new kind of infrastructures. And so briefly, I'd like to go kind of through the vignettes of these ideas that I'm proposing for the region. And so this here would be the logistics and shipping center, kind of right at the crux of the threshold into the Arctic Ocean between Russia and Alaska. And this would start to kind of generate toll and tax money to I guess, build out the infrastructure for the Arctic. Here you see a hunting platform that allows kind of subsistence hunting to occur even when the ice starts to fade away and starts to melt away. And then thinking about kind of reflexive infrastructure and how we start to build new types of platforms or new types of I guess, bridges and walkways that integrate into the fluid condition of the ground there. And then looking kind of at some of these old pieces of infrastructure like military bases and how they might be repurposed to house new communities or house communities that might be at stake. And then looking kind of at this fission between recreation science stations and how you start to have infrastructures that share different user groups. And then lastly, kind of what my research has been going towards now is this idea of kind of renewable resources in the area and kind of how can we start to shift away from oil and gas exploration, but into kind of the mining of glacial sand, which basically is a renewable resource and also can start to kind of generate local income. And so I think the takeaway for me is that it's really important that designers start to take on these tough political questions and really start to engage in large systems, but then also are able to kind of think about how those large systems then get manifested in kind of local and phenomenal space. And so, yeah, in a roundabout way, that's kind of how I ended up eating this very, very smelly bird in Greenland. Thank you.